All right, everybody, welcome to lecture number 5. Today, we are going to continue our conversation about race and talk about how the concept of race, which has become so prolific in the Western world, really developed and the kind of core ideas behind it. So, anthropologists have shown for many years now that there's actually no biological reality to the concept of race. And that when we think about race, we're actually thinking about a series of socially constructed assumptions that link the color of our skin and the phenotypical characteristics like our nose shape, our size, height, weight, and all of these other things to basic ideas about behavior and intelligence. So, what I want to talk about today is actually, how I want to begin to talk about this kind of complex issue of how the concept of race became invented, is to start with a contemporary debate about race. So, yesterday, the Supreme Court agreed to try a case brought against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina by the Students for Fair Admission. So the plaintiffs in this case want to abolish race-conscious admission policies that use race and ethnicity as one of many factors in considering admission into these pretty elite universities. So what I want to hear from you guys is, what do you think? Knowing that race is a social construct, should we use this construct in considering admissions to universities? So if you're watching this at home, we would be discussing this live in class. So you can write down some thoughts about what you think there about college admissions and race. So to start with this conversation off in terms of the history, I want to start with an idea established by Ashley Montagu in 1942. So Ashley Montagu was a student of Franz Boas, and he was one of the first people to make the argument that there are no races, but that there are what he called clines. So according to Montagu, traits that we consider to be racial are actually traits that depend on environmental and behavioral factors. In general, each of these traits has a kind of distinct distribution from other traits, and these traits are rarely determined by a single genetic factor. So this kind of random distribution of biological traits is what Ashley Montagu called a cline. It's this idea that each trait has a distinct distribution and they're rarely determined by a single genetic factor. So based on the reading based on the YouTube video that you guys watched, what kind of factors have led to differences in skin color? This would be a time in class where we'd break out into small groups. You guys would have a chance to discuss. So if you're watching at home, take some time and look at your notes from the viewing that you did. So based on the reading slash video, skin color is correlated to the amount of solar radiation, specifically UVB rays, that humans are exposed to. Dark skin, as you can see in this map, is found in Africa, India, and Australia, where the amount of UVB rays is the highest. However, many other genetic traits in peoples from these areas are not similar. So this is what Montagu was getting at with clines, right? That there's lots of different genetic facets that come into play, not just things involved in the environment. Furthermore, similar skin colors can be caused by differences in genes. For example, genetic pathways to dark skin are actually different in Tamil Nadu people from the Indian subcontinent compared to people from Nigeria. In other words, genetic traits typically don't correlate with one another and are not distributed in the same place or in the same way over time. So while race is not a part of our biology, it is definitely a part of our culture. In the ancient world, think about the 4th century BC. Physical and behavioral differences were linked to linguistic and cultural practices. And it's during this time that we start to see the kind of origins of a kind of concept of race beginning. So as a result of this kind of linking of physical differences with linguistic and cultural practices, early Christians, Hebrews, and Greeks kind of allowed out groups to overcome their alleged inferiority by converting to the superior or dominant group through assimilation. The Greeks, for example, allowed so-called barbarians, basically anybody who was a non-Greek, to learn to speak, write, and think like Greeks. So you could become Greek even if you looked different, if you had originally had a different cultural practice, or if you learned how to speak Greek. In the 15th century, the Spanish actually introduced a new form of racial thinking that decoupled physical characteristics from cultural characteristics. So in response to the rising number of Jewish people in Spain who had been forced to convert to Catholicism and were actually gaining financial status in the church, the Spanish monarchy began to make a legal distinction between old and new Christians based on biology. Anyone with Jewish ancestry in the past 5 generations was considered a new Christian and subject to a number of restrictions, including not being able to attend college or hold government positions. The Spanish crown issued what was called purity of blood certificates, which were used to prove that individuals were either members of the inferior or superior group. So it's during 15th century Spanish Inquisition that we actually see biology become a determinant of particular rights and privileges within the state. The Spanish Inquisition itself began in 1478 and was established to make sure that people with Jewish ancestry were kept apart from the mainstream society. Unlike earlier Inquisitions, the Spanish version expanded to include ethnicity, or what was becoming an emerging concept of race, to talk about the impurity of blood. So although these kind of discriminating practices began as a result of economic and political jealousy over the wealth and influence of a small sector of Jewish society, scientific theories justifying this kind of racism began to appear in Spain and Portugal in the 15th century. These ideas were expanded to justify similar racist ideas towards Native Americans and later enslaved Africans brought to Spanish colonies. So Columbus's voyage to America was at the peak of this period of the Spanish Inquisition. So as Europeans were encountering new people, they were beginning to expand their definitions and understandings and explanations that would justify the mistreatment of these new people who looked different. So there's kind of 2 major theories which developed to explain racial hierarchies during the 16th century: the pre-Adamite and the degenerate theory. So the degenerate theory proposed that Native American origins could be traced to the migration of biblical people that had kind of degenerated over time from the original Adam and Eve. The basic assumption here is that all humans were created by God at the beginning, with Adam and Eve as our progenitors. Then this kind of degenerative condition of non-whites was created through things like climate, alternative lifeways, and isolation from Christian civilization. In some ways, the degenerate theory was actually a more liberal point of view for the time, since proponents of this theory believed that degenerates could, in fact, be uplifted through missionization and education. This idea first promoted by the degenerate theory was taken up during the 18th, 17th, and 18th century by natural historians who attempted to explain the factors that led some people to have white skin versus dark skin, and to talk about the development of lifeways that they considered inferior, right? To understand these degenerate lifeways. So a key figure here was French naturalist Georges Louis Leclerc, who developed the most complete explanation of human variation for the time. Leclerc argued that there was only one species of man, but that various factors like climate, nutrition, lifestyle, and disease caused different groups to degenerate from this ideal original human. As you see in this quote behind me by Leclerc, he directly links skin color to climate and beauty, arguing that people in Europe were the most beautiful and best fit. So what's really critical to kind of note here is that Leclerc was actually pointing to what has become a kind of scientific truth, that skin color is caused by differences in climate and the reaction of UVB rays to light, right? That's what we learned in the video. But what Leclerc does, which modern science doesn't do, is to then associate certain skin colors with ideas about beauty and best fitness or civilization. So the pre-Adamite theory, which is the alternative to the degenerate theory, argued that Native Americans were not descendants of Adam and Eve, but had an independent earlier origins that predated Adam and Eve, hence pre-Adamite. So whichever theory you choose, whether you believed that non-Europeans had a separate origin, or you believed that all humans were direct descendants of Adam and Eve, Spanish colonizers used these theories kind of selectively to justify the maltreatment of non-white peoples by claiming they were subhuman. So even though the Spanish government had and the church eventually declared that all native peoples were fully human, their mistreatment continued. And I would also note that both of these theories continue to shape policies, colonial policies in the 17th and 18th century and into the 19th century. So the degenerate theory was probably the most accepted theory about kind of the relationship between skin color and inferiority or intelligence. During the 15th and 16th century, the pre-Adamite theory, or what became known as the polygenetic theory, became the dominant kind of mode of thinking in the mid-19th century. So the polygenetic theory that was most influential, it's this polygenetic theory that was most influential in kind of racist ideologies and has had the most staying power. And this kind of theory was first laid out by Isaac Lapierre, who published a kind of treatise in 1655. So Lapierre was from a family of Spanish Jews who had been expelled from Spain in the 15th century. And he argued that there were millions of people prior to Adam, but they lived in a miserable state. Then God created Adam and began Jewish history to save mankind. His book challenged the authenticity of the Bible and was burned and banned in many countries across Europe. His kind of polygenetic thesis, which is encapsulated in the pre-Adamite theory, was continuously revived as the best explanation of new archaeological and biblical findings that seem to contradict the Bible. So during the 18th century, the renowned Scottish philosopher David Hume drew on Perrier's ideas to develop a polygenetic theory of racism. Basically, Hume advocated the separate creation and innate inferiority of non-white peoples. And he used historical inductive reasoning to argue that civilization had never existed outside of Europe. Following in Hume's footsteps, Immanuel Kant essentially created the first racist anthropology, which was rooted in the concept of skin color. In many ways, Kant can be considered the father of the modern concept of race and racist anthropology, which dominated much of the discipline up until World War II. Kant classified humans into four races based on skin color and climate, and he believed that characteristics of racial groups depended upon climate. So he's arguing that there was a direct dependency between behavior, skin color, and climate. So his theory of race corresponded to intellectual ability and limitation, with kind of clear differences between Europeans, Asians, Africans, and Native Americans linked to ideas about innate talent. So according to Kant's ideas, the nature of the white race guaranteed their position at the top. This was followed by Asians, Africans, and then by Native Americans, right? Or what he coded as yellow, black, and then red. So although Kant, in much of his writings, was a champion of the equality of all men and civil liberties, these were actually only for humans who he perceived to have the ability to educate themselves, and therefore they were only for whites. Non-whites existed on a lower rung in this kind of moral ladder. And he believed that Black and Native peoples didn't have the ability to think moral thoughts, i.e., they didn't have the ability to reason. And they also didn't have the ability to carry them out, which is what Kant conceptualized as free will. And therefore, Black and Native peoples could not be considered fully human. So Kant really taught this brand of kind of geographic anthropology for 40 years, really embedding this kind of scientific concept of physical race in Germany and then in Europe and the rest of the United States. The publication of the textbook Types of Mankind in 1854 used this kind of polygenetic ideas that Kant perpetuated and other types of racist assumptions linked to intelligence to justify slavery. Using data on skull size and shape collected by craniometrists, like we talked about on Tuesday, the authors of The Types of Mankind argued that human races had different origins and were actually different species. These kind of different species mixed and led to inferior people both biologically and intellectually. They also argued that the mix of white and non-white races would cause the deterioration of civilization, and that the white race was the superior and truly civilized race. One of their big arguments was that there was no reason to actually give people of color an education or other aspects of civilization because they simply were too inferior to actually benefit from these aspects of society. Types of Mankind is probably the single most important work to set the issue of race into a scientific context for the general public. So they're taking ideas that had primarily been circulating around philosophers and social scientists and making it digestible to the broader public. This notion of racial purity and the dangers of interbreeding in particular became extremely popular in the United States, particularly in the South during the mid-1800s on the brink of the Civil War. So this is a time where we would take a break in class, and I would ask you guys again to talk about why you think the connection between skin color and race has been so resilient. So take a moment and write down your thoughts. So in previous centuries, climate and the environment have been seen as kind of directly shaping physiological and behavioral traits. This idea, however, began to change in Western Europe and the United States in the late 1800s. An embryologist named August Weismann was critical in making this shift. Weizmann showed that what he called germ cells could not be affected by environment, but were transmitted unaltered from one generation to the next. So, what Weizmann was talking about is heredity, the passing on of physical or mental traits genetically from one generation to the next. And this moved us away from the idea that everything about an individual was shaped by the environment and climate. So this was a major blow to the idea of a kind of single human ancestor. And environmentalists, since they were left with no other explanation of how the differences between people could be explained outside of the environment. As a result of this kind of new concept of genetics, it was no longer believed that the degenerate changes that were thought to cause certain races to be inferior could be fixed by changing or improving someone's environment. This concept of heredity, when combined with Darwin's ideas about natural selection, gave scientific credence to biological determinists, creating a perfect environment for the rise of what became the eugenics movement. Social theorists used Darwin's ideas of adaptation to reinforce the claim that the rich and powerful were better adapted to the socioeconomic climate of the time. This is what we talked about on Tuesday, is social Darwinism, and the kind of key figure here being Herbert Spencer. So Spencer used this kind of concept of natural selection to support the idea that it was natural, it was normal, and it was actually proper for the strong to thrive at the expense of the weak. Spencer is often thought of as kind of the source of all social Darwin ideology, and he's the one who coined this phrase, survival of the fittest. Basically, he argued that future generations needed to experience the natural outcome of their conduct and not be interfered with by governments or charity. Spencer's work was greatly influenced by another philosopher at the time, Thomas Malthus, who wrote this essay on the principle of population. So Malthus was an economist, and he claimed that in nature, plants and animals produce more offspring than can survive, and that even humans are capable of overproducing if they're left unchecked. Malthus predicted that social improvements resulted in population growth, which would lead to negative effects like famine, disease, and death. Spencer's writings were incredibly popular, and his books sold more than 1 million copies in his lifetime. So Spencer is using these ideas about population competition and the need for the strongest to survive in order to justify kind of policies that would come to limit population production by what was considered inferior races. All right. So the artifact of the day is Chaco Canyon. Make sure to go into your attendance quiz on D2L and click Chaco Canyon so I know that you've watched some of the lecture or you attended class today. Okay, so let's get into what eugenics is and the kind of key ideas here. So the eugenics movement was a direct extension of social Darwinism, but the two were definitely not the same. Eugenics, both the term and the movement behind it, was the brainchild of Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin. So Galton coined the term eugenics in 1883 from the Greek word for well-born. Galton believed that controlled breeding of humans was not only doable, but a highly desirable goal. And he spent a lot of his professional career, basically from the 1870s until his death in 1911, investigating the potential of eugenics as a government policy. Among the traits that Galton assumed to be inherited were character, personality, intellectual ability, longevity, sexual passion, aversion to mean, craving for drink and gambling, susceptibility to opium, which was an incredibly popular drug during this time, proclivity to commit crimes, madness, or tuberculosis. So Galton didn't limit his eugenic ideas to individuals, but actually included racial differences as well. So he believed that the average African American intellectual standard was 2 grades below Anglo-Saxons, and saw Anglo-Saxons as 2 grades lower than the ancient Greeks. Galton's goal was basically to promote mating between specific races in order to give the more suitable race or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing. So there's kind of two separate camps when we think about eugenics. The positive camp of eugenics called for control of human breeding to produce genetically superior people. The negative eugenics lobbied for improving the quality of the human race by eliminating biologically inferior people from the population through the use of segregation, deportation, castration, marriage laws, compulsory sterilization, and straight up extermination. So in the early 1900s, positive eugenesis was more popular in the United Kingdom, while negative eugenics was actually more in vogue in the United States. So I think the paradigm, right, of negative eugenics is the Nazi policy of extermination against Jewish people during World War II. So Germany definitely was not the first government to use euthanasia for racist eugenic purposes. The idea was actually first proposed in 1911 in the United States as part of a policy to eliminate what was considered the defective germplasm in the American population. So Hitler and the Nazis' racially kind of driven eugenics policies were actually invented by racists in the 19th century and were resurrected in the early 20th century by the eugenics movement. So as we've seen, many academics during the late 1800s began to endorse biologically deterministic theories of human behavior. These efforts are perhaps best exemplified by the introduction of intelligence testing, which was first developed in France by Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon in 1905. After visiting Europe in 1908, Herbert Goddard translated the Binet-Simon intelligence test into English and distributed thousands of copies across the US with the goal of identifying what he considered feeble-minded children. In dialogue with prominent biologist Charles Davenport, Goddard developed the theory that hereditary defect was the cause of feeble-mindedness and that these traits caused criminality. By World War I, scientists and the public believed that America was beset by what he called the menace of the feeble-minded. Intelligence testers believed that between 1/3 and about a half of all criminals and prostitutes were feeble-minded or morons. So this idea of being a moron was actually this was a term that was coined by Goddard as part of his intelligence testing experiments. Soon, biologists began to assume that intelligence and feeble-mindedness were a single gene trait. So they linked intelligence to genetics, which were passed down hereditarily. These ideas were used to discriminate among ethnic and racial groups. In 1910, the Eugenics Record Office, led by Charles Davenport, opened with the support of the Carnegie Institute in Washington, D.C. Davenport saw different racial and ethnic groups as biologically different beings and believed that permanent improvements of the race could only be brought about by breeding the best. So the Eugenics Record Office was kind of the nerve center of the eugenics movement in the United States and had three main functions. It was intended to conduct scientific research on heredity. It was supposed to popularize ideas about genetics, and it lobbied Congress for eugenics-related legislation. So this is another time when we take a quick break and have you guys talk to your peers about the impacts that you think eugenics has had on our society today. So take a second and write down some thoughts. So the Eugenics Record Office, who was directed by Harry Laughlin, proposed a model of sterilization which stressed the need to sterilize populations, including the feeble-minded, insane, morally degenerate, and criminal. Some people were actually even sterilized for just being poor. Sterilization laws were attempted in Michigan in 1897 and in Pennsylvania in 1905, but were actually defeated. By 1922, only 3,200 sterilizations had been performed, on inmates in prisons, in insane asylums, and other institutions of social welfare. 80% of these sterilizations were actually carried out in what we consider a progressive state, California. Even with all these efforts at sterilization, eugenics was not widely popular in these early years, and many of the efforts of active eugenicists were thwarted. This all began to change after the first International Eugenics Congress meeting in 1912, after which time the eugenics movement became widely accepted in the United States for the next 30 years. In 1913, Davenport and Laughlin established the Eugenics Record Association to promote all of this kind of use of eugenics research and legislation. A key platform of the movement was marriage restrictions and selective breeding. By 1930, 30 states had sterilization laws and roughly 36,000 people had been sterilized. Between 1910 and 1939, ERO, Eugenic Records Office field workers, were sent around the US to collect anthropometric data and family histories from hospitals, asylums, prisons, and schools for the deaf and blind. The goal was to identify the complete family pedigree of individuals considered physically, medically, and culturally unfit. This kind of ethnographic research produced a list of 10 socially unfit groups. The remedy was to eliminate this kind of inferior germplasm through marriage laws, compulsory birth control, forced segregation, sterilization, and euthanasia. Eugenicists worked hard to pass marriage legislation. By the 1930s, there was laws prohibiting marriage of alcoholics in 4 different states, epileptics in 17 states, and feeble-minded in 41 states. The Eugenics Records Office also collected pedigrees of eminent and racially acceptable families as part of their strategy to increase the number of superior classes. To do this, polygamy and systematic mating was suggested, as well as financial incentives to increase propagation in acceptable families. Although eugenics wasn't specifically focused on race, eliminating inferior races was always a major goal of the movement. To eugenicists, the unfit groups included non-Nordic races and any children produced by a mix of these races were considered kind of inferior. Davenport stressed that intermarriage between African Americans and Eastern Europeans, whose genetic stock was considered inferior to Anglo-Saxons, really threatens the future of America. In 1913, 29 of the 40 states had laws forbidding race mixing. 29 of those were focused specifically on intermixing between white and black communities. 8 of those were actually focused on intermixing between Asian groups like Chinese and Japanese and whites. And some states even had laws forbidding mixed intermarriage and intermarriage between Native communities and whites. In 1924, Virginia's Racial Integrity Act was passed, which made falsely registering one's race as a felony and banned marriage between whites and any person with even 1 drop of non-Caucasian blood. This law actually survived until 1966. Alabama and Georgia were actually the first 2 states to follow suit. And the first state to actually ban anti-miscegenation laws was California in 1948. By the 1960s, 17 states still had anti-miscegenation laws prohibiting interracial marriage. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed our class, and we'll see you all next week.